should we assume that French rule of Madison has suddenly given up its commitment to imperialism, because barely 4 months after the French troops in Vietnam were to lay down their arms, they were to be firing again, this time, of course, at the national and social aspirations of the Algerian people. But you see in the final analysis that French ruling class had no alternative but to quit in Vietnam, because if it had any other course of action, or if it pursued any other course, it would have jeopardized very gravely the social order inside France, and it would have jeopardized even more the military capability of France in other parts of the empire. Consider, if you please, that French expeditionary force had been fighting in Indochina for almost 8 years and had not broken the back of the Viet Minh. Consider, in the second place, that France could not continue to pay for that war, could not continue the cost of that war, despite the fact that American aid was already defraying something like 3/4 of the expenses of it, without burdening the French working classes with a tremendous tax burden and with runaway inflation, all of which could have created social chaos inside of France, and consequently, the French felt they had to make peace. And it was, after all, the disaster of Dien Bien Phu in March and April and May of 1954, which was, in a sense, the last straw, which really convinced the French that they had to get out. Because you must remember that by mid-March of 1954, General Giap and his Viet Minh army, having bottled up 18 full battalions of the French expeditionary force, launched a tremendous attack against Dien Bien Phu, combining infantry assault with very heavy artillery fire, until such time as that expeditionary force, which was the main bulk, you see, of the French colonial army, really was doomed. And when Dien Bien Phu should fall, as it would do on the 7th of May of 1954, what possible alternative remained for the French establishment except to negotiate a peace at the best possible terms, or to risk a total defeat in Indochina, both in the north and in the south of the country of Vietnam? Now, as far as Ho Chi Minh and his comrades were concerned, they agreed to go to Geneva to negotiate. And that, in a sense, was a very critical decision, because their army had been successful in North Vietnam, and it most certainly could have invaded the South and, in a sense, overrun the South. But in the calculations of Ho and his comrades was that ever-present concern that the United States might come in force if the Viet Minh armies were to cross the 16th or the 17th parallel and move towards Saigon. And consequently, they chose, as Ho almost always did, the path of prudence, to accept provisionally a division or a partition of that country, on the assumption, after all, that once the French military expeditionary force left the country, and once elections should be held after the French departed, that by all possible means the country would be unified, the people would opt for that unification under Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese Communist Party. Nor was that assumption in any way unrealistic, because, after all, the Geneva Accords, which the 9 negotiating powers finally were to conclude on the 21st of July of 1954, should, by all logic, have enshrined the victory of the Vietnamese Revolution. Because fundamentally, even if there was a partition that was provided for by the Geneva Accords, even if the Accords said that the country was to be divided at the 17th parallel, and that the Viet Minh forces were to gather north of that 17th parallel and the French to gather to the south, it was definitively declared in the final declaration of the Geneva Conference that that partition was a provisional arrangement, that it was not to last any longer than 2 years, that at the maximum, on the 20th of July of 1956, there would have to take place elections in both parts of Vietnam, the zone north of the 17th and the zone south. And that those elections, after all, were to name a government for a unified Vietnam. There was no intention ever that the partition should be permanent or definitive. And that in the interim, until that reunification were to take place, that both Vietnams were to be politically and militarily neutral, that no foreign power was to intrude either politically or militarily, certainly not to send in military force in any large scale as the Americans were to do. And you see, since the five great powers that participated in the Geneva Conference, the United States, Great Britain, France, China, and the USSR, all of them seemed to agree to the final declaration of the Geneva Conference. It seemed certain that those accords would finally bring an end to almost 100 years of struggle for national independence in Vietnam, and for almost 25 years of struggle for a social revolution mounted by that Vietnamese Communist Party. But as you know in your own experience, as we know in our own history, that the Geneva Accords, after all, ran smack into the imperatives of American imperialism. And those imperatives were to run roughshod over what had been done at Geneva by July of 1954. That the ink, after all, was scarcely dry on the final declaration before American policymakers began to lay the foundations for what would become the most brutal war ever imposed by anyone upon a poor third world country. Now, we know perfectly well that for more than 4 years before the Geneva Accords, American policymakers had been very heavily involved in Indochina, that they had done most of the subsidizing by the hundreds of millions of dollars and then the billions of dollars of the French war there. By no means were they interested in saving a colony for France. That certainly wasn't the purpose of American policymakers. Quite on the contrary, they assumed that an anti-communist Vietnam, if it could be preserved, would no longer be an exclusive preserve for the French, but in fact would become a bastion of American influence in Southeast Asia. Now let's stop for a moment and ponder that assumption and ponder the vast significance of that assumption. Because you see, it precludes any real understanding of the deep-seated sources of the Vietnamese Revolution. It precludes any understanding of what the needs and the aspirations of the Vietnamese people, elaborated over so long a period of time, actually were. What I'm saying is that the basic assumptions of American policymakers, like all ardent imperialists, are always grounded in a certain kind of ahistoricism and unconcern, if you please, about the history of the people who are going to be invaded or the history whose destiny is going to be shaped. It's as though third world countries were only the objects of the desires of great powers and not the subjects of history themselves. And so it was that an old Vietnamese militant who had been with Ho Chi Minh at Fontainebleau in 1946 said to me one day in Paris with incredible exasperation, "I don't understand you people. You were never in our history. How do you come here now to reshape it?" But consider, after all, the observation that was made in December of 1953 by Richard Nixon, then the Vice President, and already a skilled artisan in the monumental platitude. And consequently, Nixon was to say in December of 53, there would be no Indo-Chinese war if it weren't for the direct interference of Communist China. No matter that war had begun in November of 1946, more than 3 years before there was a communist China. No matter, after all, that the aspirations of the Vietnamese people rooted back for their independence something like 100 years. The point is that that kind of historical thinking is absent when you desire, after all, simply to dominate, when you desire to infeudate a country. And isn't that very vaunted domino theory really also anchored in that ahistorical thinking? Because after all, the assumption there is that revolutions are really something like infections, that they go from one outside source into another country, and that they are not really the result or the product of the very profound internal social contradictions in any given society. And so you get the commentary of David Bruce, who was the American ambassador to Paris, called before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in January of 1951 to elaborate the domino theory in these terms. There is no question that in Indochina went, the fall of Burma and the fall of Thailand would be absolutely inevitable. And no one can convince me, for what it is worth, that Malay and India wouldn't follow thereafter. And then do you find in that, as I do, a tremendous and grievous insult to Indians and Burmese and Thai, to people who may make their own revolutions and not simply be infected from the outside or fall like a domino? But you see, if American thinking was paranoid and grotesque and preposterous, its goals were very clear and very reasonable in their terms. Because you see, Vietnam belonged to Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia already was looked upon as a source of great mineral wealth and a source of potential markets that really might be vast. And so you get it explicated in the memoirs of President Eisenhower, A Mandate for Change, in which he writes very categorically, the loss of all Vietnam, together with Laos on the west and Cambodia on the southwest, would have meant the surrender to communist enslavement of millions. On the important material side, it would have spelled the loss of valuable deposits of tin and prodigious supplies of rubber and rice. You see, by the mid-50s, you already have the bare outlines of what later would be called the Pacific Basin Strategy. The Pacific Basin Strategy referring, after all, to a zone, to those countries that touch upon the Pacific Ocean and that touch upon the Indian Ocean, a kind of vast trade and investment complex, which it was considered ultimately to be more valuable potentially than the Latin American market or the European market. And when you see in the mid-1960s, the geologists got to work and they discovered signs of offshore oil in that Pacific basin, then of course American policymakers were beady-eyed about the area, frenetic about the idea that it should be inserted into a revolutionary world and consequently stripped from the American empire. And so we are not in the slightest surprised that before the Geneva Conference met, that American policymakers moved hell and high water to prevent it from meeting. And while it met, they tried as best they could to ignore it or break it up. And then when finally the accords were signed, they were categorically opposed to them and determined not to observe them. Consider, if you please, that mission of General Ely to Washington in March of 1954. Paul Ely was the chief of staff of the French army. And when he arrived in Washington on the 20th of March of 54, it was to to tell the policymakers in that capital that the game was up for the French in Indochina, that Dien Bien Phu was practically a disaster, and that consequently France would go to the Geneva Conference. What Amy wanted was a minimum amount of military help to prevent a total catastrophic defeat at Dien Bien Phu, with the idea that it should hold out until an agreement was struck at Geneva so that France could strike the best possible bargain. And he was incredibly surprised when the Chief of Staff of the American Armed Forces, Admiral Bradford, didn't offer him a minimum supply, but massive aid, with the idea not of holding the Vietnamese off, but of winning the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, because Bradford came forth with what was called Operation Vulture, which meant that there would be massive B-29 strikes from the Clark airfield in the Philippines, along with strikes by fighters that were on aircraft carriers in the 7th Fleet, the idea being that the French would be in a much better bargaining position if they won the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. But that wasn't enough for that rabid Presbyterian John Foster Dulles, who was then the Secretary of State, and he was not interested in one big massive strike. He was interested in a continuous massive strike, and consequently he began to talk not only to Amy but to the French and British about what he called the internationalization of the Vietnamese War, because what Dulles and the other very ardent expansionists wanted really was to scuttle the Geneva Conference, to continue the war, and, if possible, to simply replace the French in the leadership of that struggle against the Vietnamese communists. In other words, really to guarantee that standing and status and root of the American position in Vietnam. Why internationalization? Why should he have gone to the British and the French and said, let's have a coalition and we will supply from the United States the equipment for this escalated war? Because quite obviously there were cold warriors at the time who were perfectly willing to make a unilateral action. It was again Richard Nixon, who spoke very frequently for that group in that period, who said on the 16th of April of '54, before a conference of newspaper editors, the United States cannot accept further retreat in Asia. If this government cannot avoid it, the administration must face up to the situation and immediately dispatch its own forces. But you see, Dulles had consulted the leaders of Congress, and he consulted the great weather vane, Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon said, better get the other ones there. And consequently, it was to the British and to the French that Dulles then applied and said, we'll do all the supplying, you send a token force. The French wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't touch it because they were beaten, they couldn't go on with the war, and they wanted to go to that conference. But Eve wouldn't touch it either for the British Foreign Office. He said to Dulles, how can I go to the British public, after all, a week before the Geneva Conference is supposed to open, which was called to end this war, and say that we're going to escalate it? And Eden tells us in his memoirs that 2 days before the Geneva Conference opened, Dulles was back again, begging and saying, just send a token force and we in a minute can send our troops in, and that collapsed. But at the same time, Dulles and the others were hell-bent on creating those structures which bypassed the Geneva Conference and the Geneva Accords. Consider that while the negotiations were going on in Switzerland, that Dulles was laying the foundation for the Asiatic variant of NATO, which we call SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And SEATO, when the treaty was finally signed in September of 1954, among the 7 signatories of the United States, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, Thailand, and Pakistan, when that treaty was finally signed, what it did was to establish a very solid anti-revolutionary, anti-communist treaty organization, which would be militarily supplied by the United States. You see the point that America is establishing those barriers against any kind of revolutionary change. By no means are they going to accommodate the reunification of Vietnam by the Accords or by the arrangements of the Geneva Accords. But even more pointedly than that, in June of 1954, it was pressure from Washington on Bao Dai, who was the puppet president of the so-called Republic of South Vietnam. It was pressure from Washington that got Bao Dai to appoint as his prime minister and as the strong man south of the 17th parallel, and Ngo Dinh Diem. And Diem comes onto the scene at this point, most certainly as the instrument of American policy, because you're dealing with a Catholic Mandarin, you're dealing with an extreme right-wing nationalist, who after all was the invention of, the discovery of the United States in terms of his position within Vietnamese politics. You go all the way back to the year 1950. And Diem, who was an ardent Catholic, was going to attend the so-called Holy Year celebration in Rome. But on the way, he stopped off in Tokyo, and there made contact with a CIA operative who also passed as a professor of political science in Michigan State University, and who was called Wesley Fischel. And Fischel was enchanted with Diem because he felt that Diem was really the perfect instrument. He was both ardently anti-French and anti-communist. That means he didn't want the French there, he didn't want the Americans there, or didn't want the communists there. It's a perfect vacuum within which, obviously, the American influence can penetrate. This Fischel, I might point out, some years later became that official in South Vietnam for the Diem government, who expended millions of American dollars in establishing the very extensive and elaborate police force for South Vietnam. He would not be the only so-called professor in a Big Ten university who would play that kind of role in the war in Vietnam. Well, it was Michigan State University then that financed the very effective journey that Diem made to the United States in 1951, where he made effective contacts with key personalities in the American political establishment. He saw and very favorably impressed Senator John Kennedy. But mainly he made a fantastic impression on that ever-ready Christian warrior, Francis Spellman, who was then the Cardinal in New York. And it was that Cardinal Spellman, after all, who in September of 1954 would address an American Legion convention, which was one of his favorite places anyway, and there would explain precisely that the United States was not going to observe the Geneva Accords, and as a matter of fact, that Diem was very much their man. If the Geneva Accords, said Spellman on the 1st of September of 54, if the Geneva Accords mean anything, they mean taps for the very hopes of freedom in Southeast Asia. Vietnam has been the victim of the world communist conspiracy. But our brother, Ngo Dinh Diem, will fight to hold the line for Christian civilization in Asia. One hadn't known it was there, but suffice it to say that was the position. So it doesn't very much surprise us that on the morrow of the Geneva Accords of July of 1954, that American policymakers began an interference in and a dominion over South Vietnam, which was going to render those accords perfectly inoperative. As early as October of 54, the United States sent a special envoy to South Vietnam, General Collins, who announced when he got there that the United States would spend $2 billion in order to bring the South Vietnamese army up to a strength of 250,000 fighting men. Now, despite the fact that in the Geneva Accords there was a very, very direct prohibition against any kind of intrusion by an outside power, intrusion by way of military supply, intrusion by way of military interference. Nonetheless, the United States undertook almost at once to pay the entire bill to outfit the military and the police apparatus of South of Vietnam. By the end of 1956, all French troops were out of Vietnam, and the Americans gradually were replacing them as the advisors to the South Vietnamese government. Because by the end of 56, the number of so-called advisors in MAC, the military aid and advisory group, was far in excess of the 685 advisors, which was the limit set by the Geneva Accords for any outside power. Then what did Hanoi do? Ho Chi Minh and his friends protested and accepted for the most part. That is, there was not the slightest impulse to resume the war. On the one hand, of course, there was the hope that in some manner the Geneva Accords would become effective. But on the other hand, don't forget that this is a revolutionary government in Hanoi, and that it is concerned, after all, with the edification of socialism. It has to build something. If it has the zone north of the 17th parallel, it's going to address it. And consequently, on the morrow of the Geneva Accords, the government of the so-called Democratic Republic of North Vietnam set out on a course in a very poor and very shattered country to build a viable society. Now, you know, even in the books that are most critical about North Vietnam, which are bitterly anti-communist, like Buttinger's book, for example, Dragon in Battle, and that second volume which deals so much with this period of the 1950s, in those pages, even Buttinger cannot disagree that there was something rather remarkable about the reconstruction effort that Ho and his government undertook, that there was a kind of collective operation to try to restore the country, to try to build the foundations of something else, which was certainly unparalleled in that particular Southeast Asian zone. But of course, being a bitter anti-communist, Buttinger has to interpret it in a certain way. And he says it is quite obviously the product of coercion, quite obviously the product of police-state tactics, of communist tactics, which are characteristic and very typical. And you see, basically, we're all brainwashed a little bit by that sort of thing. And that essentially we live in a society where the values are so much oriented around self-interest and so little about collective behavior that it's hard to believe that any collective behavior could have been either spontaneous or voluntary. And besides, even when we're on the left, we're very super-conscious, as we should be, about bureaucratic distortions, about all of those perversions of Stalinism, which have occurred in communist societies. And yet, what happened in North Vietnam was described by a very good friend of mine, Gérald Chalian, who lived among them for a number of years and wrote a marvelous book called Mythes révolutionnaires dans le tiers-monde, Revolutionary Myths in the Third World. And what Chalian uses is a phrase that I commend to your attention. He says that what happened in North Vietnam, in terms of socialist edification or socialist building, is what you can call the Puritanism of primitive socialist accumulation. What he's saying is that the North Vietnamese people really were ascetics, really were ascetic in their approach, really made incredible sacrifices, really had incredible self-discipline, because to a considerable degree they believed in that government. The Communist Party was very deeply implanted in their history and in their lives, and consequently, when they struggled for themselves, and that assumption carried them very far. You have to imagine what North Vietnam was like on the morrow of the war. You have to remember that it is devastated after 8 years of war, when most of that war went on in that northern zone. You have to remember, in the second place, that in the waning days of the war, and then in the days while the French occupation was still there, that the Diem regime in the south carted all from the northern zone every valuable piece of property that it could get its hands on, both private and public. That it dismantled harbor installations and railroad repair yards and broadcasting stations and shipped them off to the south. That it emptied factories of their raw materials, of their machines, of their finished products. In a word, that you're starting really from scratch, and what had to be done right away was simply to repair the damage. And you get these spectacular results, that the railroad from Hanoi to Nongson to the Chinese border was repaired in toto within 6 months, and that 80,000 men worked on that repair task. That in all over that area north of the 17th parallel, bridges were being repaired, and dams and roads were being repaired, with tens of thousands of men and women in labor brigades living on very short rations. But what is more interesting to us is the fact that in those circumstances, the government in the North really was concerned about the edification of socialism. In other words, of providing the infrastructure for a new society. We're talking, as we have on many occasions, about the difference between growth and development. We're talking in North Vietnam now about a scenario of authentic development, that the people must have an infrastructure in industry and in agriculture that will carry them at least to some human levels of consumption, some human levels of living. And so North Vietnam goes through a very real industrial revolution in those years that follow the war. And of course, she has on her side the aid of the other communist countries. It is China, it is the Soviet Union, they are the countries of Eastern Europe, which really do send industrial equipment and do proper loans. And all of that is going to be tremendously important. So that by 1960, for example, at the time that the Soviet Union gave a very large loan to Hanoi to build 43 factories that were designed. By that time already, just 6 years after the war had ended, North Vietnam was well on the road to becoming the most industrialized country in Southeast Asia. By 1962, they were producing products which South Vietnam did not produce with all of its American aid up to the time that the United States left in the 1970s. Was producing electrical motors, was producing machine tools, was producing small ocean craft, was producing small business machines and office machines, was producing furniture, was producing bicycle tires. You're dealing, in a sense, with a kind of incredible speed up in the industrial process. From Hà Đông to Hanoi, which is a stretch of about 10 miles, and which had been a desert in 1954. By 62, it is Jiao to Jiao factory. It is an industrial zone thick in that area. And you see, all of those factories would be obviously the target of American bombing in the war, but just think of how many of them came to be decentralized, how many of them came to be dismantled and sent into the villages where the old artisan traditions were still sufficient, that the peasantry in the villages and in the surrounding area could manage to take some of those dismantled factories and work at the machinery and produce goods all during that massive bombing that the United States would carry on. You see, there's something fascinating about this. It is possible to use aid from the outside. Sometimes it is essential to use aid from the outside if you have the goal of real development and to use it for the authentic infrastructure of the society. And you have only to compare that with what happened in South Vietnam, where a very much larger sum of money was poured in, literally by the billions, that really was usurped by building the repressive infrastructure of that society, and also to line the pockets, obviously, of profiteers. You see what Saigon became. That Saigon, after all, became a conglomerate of profiteers, of hangers-on to the American presence. By the time that Saigon was liberated, there was no productivity in it to speak of, and that in the largest megalopolis in Vietnam. But you see, it's a peasant country, and consequently what happens to the peasantry is much more important. And North Vietnam is desperate in that regard. You're dealing, after all, with the poorest part of the country, in which only 5 million hectares out of the 40 million were really arable, in which you had that tremendous parcelization of the land, so that it was already worked so intensively. There's a magnificent book that was written early in 1936 by a man named Pierre Boulou, and it is a book called Les Paysans de Delta Tonquinois, the peasants of the Tonkin Delta. And he was a geographer, and it's a very standard thesis on the agriculture of Tonkin. And Boulou, in this book, says this: given the population density on the land, any improvement in the lot of the North Vietnamese peasantry would be near impossible. The peasants, after all, are crowded in 400 to the square kilometer. By the time that Ho Chi Minh's government began the socialist reconstruction of North Vietnam, the density of the peasantry on the land had more than doubled. So you see the problem that the regime confronts. The way in which the regime addressed the problem was primarily through the instrumentality of a land reform. And then from that land reform toward the cooperative development of agriculture. And so you get the land reform of 1955, which in essence is to give the land of the rich to the poor. But there is a problem in that, and that is that there really aren't very many rich left in North Vietnam. That is to say, 65% of the peasantry really work plots of 1 hectare or less, and that there are very few of the old landlords left after the regime had been implanted there. So that in order to carry out the so-called village revolution, you get one of the very glaring distortions in socialist building in North Vietnam. Because as in every avant-garde party, you get terrific sectarians who figure that the letter of the law must be carried out. You must go into every village and you must find an unscrupulous landlord. And if you can't find one, you invent one. And so landlords, for example, as they were called, peasants who owned 3 or 4 hectares of land, were called rich and expropriated and brought to popular tribunals and their land redistributed, all of which led to a revolt. It led to a revolt of the peasantry in Ngo province, and that was very quickly repressed. Now let me say parenthetically that that uprising was much more localized and the repression much swifter and less brutal than Western accounts of it have generally made out. There is now a very comprehensive book on it by Gareth Porter called The Land Reform of North Vietnam, who insists that what the regime did, what Ho did in simply backtracking on this very unscrupulous approach to the land reform law very quickly saved the day in North Vietnam. Because Ho stepped in at the end of 1956, had the Secretary General of the Vietnamese Communist Party dismissed, the Minister of Agriculture dismissed, and consequently some of this kind of rapacious bureaucratic activity stopped immediately. But what is most important is that there was a lot of land redistribution under that reform, that about 800,000 hectares of land were redistributed to 2.5 million very poor peasant families. So that by the time you come to the end of that period, you not only have a more equitable distribution of the land, but you also have, through irrigation and through dams, in other words, through working the highlands which are dry and working the lowlands which are too wet, you get an expansion of the amount of arable land over the 1939 figure by about 1/3. By the time you come to 1959, you have completed that stage of the land reform in North Vietnam, and then begins cooperative farming. That these tiny, minuscule farms in the rice area really are inefficient unless they begin to coalesce in cooperatives. Now, cooperatives in North Vietnam were always modest. In other words, they were on a village level and not these immense, aggrandized, popular communes in China. And consequently, you get by 1962 virtually the entire country in socialist or semi-socialist cooperatives. All of which meant that the average annual rate of increase of agricultural production after 1959 was of the order of 4%, which is very responsible, and that the per hectare yield in the rice area went from 13 quintals per hectare to 21 quintals per hectare by the use of all of the technology that the state could introduce so that harvest could come not once but 2 or 3 times a year. And you see, it's more than just agriculture. You do something in the villages. You build on what had been that cohesive collective base, and you make now something different. There is a link to the past. You eliminate the notables, you eliminate the landlords, but you have that village collective. But in the village, you are doing different things. You are really trying to make socialists. Don't underestimate it. The communist cadre are there in the villages. They have been there from the very beginning. Look at the structure of a socialist North Vietnamese village. Every village has what is called a popular council, which is elected by the people in the village. And that popular council is sort of at the apex of a structure. But to the side, there is the so-called party committee. The party committee of 36, of whom 1/3 have to be women, and elected by the party members in the village. And that party committee is the funnel through which the central plan is directed to the village. But what happens, you see, during the war, when there has to be so much involvement by the people, once you get that immense and incredible American escalation, what happens is that this party committee begins to collaborate very closely with the members of the village, and the plan for the village really is set en place, right there in that local area. To the other side of the popular council is the so-called administrative committee of 9, and it is elected by the popular council, and it must have 4 women out of the 9, and consequently it is the execution or executive committee that executes the orders of this party committee. The party, in other words, is there. The party is there to direct. The party is there to see. And it raises, of course, in our minds, the question of whether this may not be too much, whether this doesn't really infringe upon freedom. Now look, and it really is critical if you understand something about what this whole problem of social change is about in contemporary societies. The communist cadre are there, and their prodding is incessant. And their prodding in North Vietnam is about a lot of old habits and a lot of old thinking and a lot of old institutions which don't belong in a socialist society. Sexism, for example, because there is an old village Vietnamese phrase that every Vietnamese I've ever heard has told me was the standard thinking about these questions. The old phrase was that 100 women are not worth the testicle of 1 man. Well, quite obviously, that's about as sexist as you could get. And so it was obvious that what you had to do was to end arranged marriages, and you had to end polygamy, and you had to make employment open to everyone. Well, how much further can it go? Is there sexual liberation for Vietnamese women, and so forth? Well, you know that Cuban film Lucia, and you know how damnably difficult it is to change very, very long and deep-seated kinds of habits and attitudes. And for the third world, Vietnam, I think, has gone very far. They have the one advantage of not being a very puritanical people. They're not nearly as puritanical as the Chinese. They're much more fun. And as a matter of fact, they have a very earthy approach to the way in which people ought to relate to each other. And I have had some, I can't really repeat them, I've had some very astonishing conversations with people who were in the delegation at Paris and who were the FLN delegation. And so forth, we talked about what was going on in the liberated zone, about what was happening in relationship to women and so forth, and there is at least an openness to these questions. But you see, the point is that the cadre, the communists who are in the village, first of all, come from the village, and secondly, have a very warm relationship with the Vietnamese people. It isn't the kind of imposition that Lenin's government, for example, had to make out in the Russian countryside, where the Bolsheviks had had virtually no contact with the peasantry before the October Revolution. Here, the Communist Party has had very deep roots in the village, and consequently there is a certain kind of identification, so that very frequently what the slogans of the particular communist leaders in a given village are really is almost instinctively understood and instinctively accepted by those villagers, and in part because the cadre live very simply. Ho Chi Minh lives simply. They're not, in the sense, that image of bureaucrats who are living fat and distant from the people. And besides, so many of the things that are said are already visible. Look, if you're in a province, like a central Vietnamese province, the province of Hong Kong, and in that province where there were 670,000 people, there was one doctor in 1954 and one nurse. By 1963, at the beginnings really of the American escalation, there were 80 doctors and there were 800 what we would call paramedics or assistant doctors. Everybody between the ages of 7 and 11 was in school. Many then went to the second and third cycles, where, if you know the great book of Lenin Dumont called L'Afrique Noire Mal Partie, Black Africa Off on the Wrong Foot, they don't make the mistake that so many third world societies make, which is to give a classical education and not teach people things that they have to know practically in their lives. And so Vietnamese kids, after all, know about irrigation, and know about water supply, and know about the soil, and know about things that are of fundamental concern to them. Well, you see, it's different than all that went on in the South. In the South, you know, one of the gripes you can make about your own government in South Vietnam is that it wasn't even in the business of real neo-colonialism. There are no real American business interests that went in and developed some industry, for example. That involved long-term risk, and nobody was going to take that. South Vietnam was always looked upon as a military base. And so it was always short-term profits through trade or trafficking or black marketeering or speculation. And in the course of that, lots of Vietnamese hangers-on in South Vietnam, so that the whole value system of that society begins to be misshapen out of all recognition, so that you get values of individualism and values of egoism and so forth that really had no place either in the Confucian lexicon or certainly not in the Marxist lexicon. The government was the dictatorial government of Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem, by October of 1955, had shoved Bao Dai aside and consequently become, for all intents and purposes, the key figure in South Vietnam, the dictatorial figure. By the 11th of January of 1956, when it was perfectly clear that there would be no elections, that the elections, after all, would not be held because there was, after all, that kind of constant talk that there couldn't be free elections. When the elections were absolutely off the agenda, Diem, who had no political support, had to begin a policy of very real repression. The 11th of January of 1956 comes that infamous law that says that anyone who is a danger to the internal security or to the national defense of South Vietnam can be sent to a concentration camp without trial. What happened then from 56 through 58 were those really wild witch hunts on the part of Diem. There were two of them. They were very concerted military campaigns to try to crack, break, destroy forever what were the remnants, what was the infrastructure, what was the clandestinity of the Viet Minh. And consequently, the first one went to the west of Saigon between June and December of 1956. The second one much longer, from June of 56 until January of 58. And I'm talking about campaigns in which literally scores of thousands were tortured and killed, in which certain villages that were uncooperative were burned and strafed. I'm talking really about the kind of terror that even Buttinger, who writes Diem so well, really cannot hack. Buttinger writes, the historical truth of the matter is that force in the struggle for the South was first used by the Diem regime, not by the communists. The military and police actions of 1956 against the Viet Minh were not undertaken in reply to communist acts of terror, since there weren't any in those years. All of which meant that the opposition to Diem would grow, and would grow on a mass basis because of two policies or two practices of the Diem regime, which really lost any possible support of the peasant masses and certainly of the villages. And so you get the so-called land reform. Now, land reform was a crying need in South Vietnam. That's where you did have the big land boards. By the time Diem assumed office as the sole dictator in South Vietnam, there were 6,300, mainly absentee landlords that owned 50% of the land in the rice basket of South Vietnam. And so a law was passed in 1955, the so-called Agrarian Reform Law, which proved to be of great, great benefit to the big landlords and a disaster for the small and landless peasant. Because by this law, all farmsteads or all holdings over 300 acres were to have the amounts over 300 acres expropriated. 300 acres was set as a limit, which was an immense farmstead, an immense holding in Vietnam. That meant that 2,200 big proprietors who owned 40% of the land were affected. But by 1962, only about half of that land over the 300 acres had been expropriated, with compensation, I should point out, and only 15% of those million hectares had been distributed to poor or landless peasants. The land was simply put on the market for sale and went to the richer ones. So far as the poor peasants were concerned, the land law applied to the land that they had been given in the redistribution that the Viet Minh had made when it occupied certain zones. The Viet Minh had distributed a large amount of land, and that was now legalized under the Diem reform, but the peasantry now had to pay for it. They had to pay their former landlords in 6 annual payments, and if they couldn't, they were expropriated. Of course, free of all the terms of this law was the Catholic Church, which owned 400,000 acres. And consequently, in the villages, the discontent with Diem was profound. Add to that the edicts of June and of October of 1956, which destroyed the election of village councils. From this point on, the dictatorship is naked. Diem appoints certain state officials to guard over the villages, mainly police officials, and then divides the country into 41 zones, each zone under a chieftain responsible only to Diem, handling the military and the policing functions. It was a proto-fascist terror that came over the people of South Vietnam, that's all. And so, you can well imagine that with all of that long history that we have traversed, that there would be resistance. And it had nothing to do with the North. Even the so-called Blue Book that the State Department published in 1961 said that the guerrillas in the South, by that particular time, were local and not invaders from the North and not recruited by the North. So you get, between 1957 and 59, the so-called political phase of opposition. It isn't armed struggle yet, with the exception of certain individual acts of terror. But what you get are political actions led by militants, strikes, manifestations, petitions, all kinds of demonstrations of opposition. And then it changes in 1959 gradually to armed struggle. And it isn't until December of 1960 that all factions of the opposition, led by the communists, come together in the NLF, in the National Liberation Front, founded in December of 1960 somewhere in South Vietnam. The exact location has still never been given. And that meant a coalition of student organizations, of Buddhist organizations, of peasant organizations, of worker groups. The communists were very central. And it's extremely interesting that a period of political struggle had preceded the military struggle. That important because there was a mature population by the time the armed struggle began. A militant of the National Liberation Front, whom I met in Paris one time, told me a story which indicated how ready the peasantry of the villages was by the time December of 1960 and the NLF was founded. Because he said that some weeks before, he had gone to a village and he had talked politically and he had tried to rouse the peasants and he had gotten no response and was very disappointed. And then suddenly an old peasant, an old elder in the village, said to him, "Oh, wait, we really do want to talk to you. We didn't notice that you were carrying a gun." Consequently, the preparation for armed insurrection or for armed opposition may have been even more delayed than necessary. But for the Vietnamese communists, and especially of the National Liberation Front, a standing policy that you see the ground very well. Note something important here. You know how this story comes out, and I don't have to tell you about it. But you see, the Liberation Front in Vietnam won its battle. And it's one of the very few that ever did. Don't rack it up to tremendous American defeat. You see, what the Vietnamese did and what the Chinese did, they did because they had a certain notion about how long it takes. They had a certain notion about how you have to implant a terrain, about how you have to know what the problems of your people are, how you have to communicate with them and live among them. That you cannot go, as Latin American romantics have gone, with their so-called Foucault theory, which is simply to say, all right, we are a band of guerrillas, make a revolution, with no understanding of what the infrastructure is around, or what even the forces of repression are. And it is literally true that posters of Che Guevara are much, much more attractive to hang than posters of Ho Chi Minh. But that doesn't cut anything. That Ho Chi Minh and those people knew a lot better how you prepare social change in third world countries and what a liberation movement is. And you see, they did some rather spectacular things. By the time they went into villages, they knew perfectly well what the villagers needed. They organized elections. They organized the redistribution of land. They abolished taxes. And consequently, they knew precisely what the peasant condition was. And they combined always that political and that military struggle, and that very crucial. And then you see, they had such an implantation in the villagers that even when the Americans decided on that incredible program that they got from Sir Robert Thompson because of his great activities in suppressing the Malay insurrection, and they got this idea of the strategic hamlets, and that they would redistribute the population, they would get royal peasants and put them in certain villages, and then they would relocate massively peasants from their home roots. and put them around cities and destroy the relationship that they might have with the revolutionary movement. Well, you know what happened. That after all, it's from those relocated peasant communities around 140 cities that the Liberation Front operated at the Tet of 1968 and really killed off that whole Hamlet program once and for all. Well, the Americans looked. They put in one person for every Vietnamese in the government, a so-called shadow government. They sent all kinds of propagandists, mainly out of the universities, to say the land reform was working, that soon there would be democracy in South Vietnam. You can't imagine the kind of propaganda that really flowed out of that area from presumably responsible academic people. The last absolute monarchs, they're responsible to nobody. And consequently, during that period of time, obviously, the Americans simply looked for a strategy. No way were they going to get out of Vietnam. No way were they going to submit to the reunification of the country or that revolution. John Kennedy became president in 1961, fascinated by the idea that conventional warfare no longer worked, that you have to have mobile responses, you have to have new tactics. He begins to gather together all those people, Maxwell Taylor, and Walt Rostow, and Roger Hillsman, and people of that kind who are concerned about those special services branches, those Green Berets, those people in counterinsurgency. Put all the think tanks to work. Learn how, after all, you can win the minds of other people, win their hearts. Well, you see, nobody in the Rand Corporation really knows as much about that as Ho Chi Minh or Mao Zedong. They read their tracts. And the idea was, in fact, there's nothing quite as popular as the tracts of Guevara and of Ho Chi Minh and of Mao Zedong among Pentagon officers and among State Department officials who were operating in third world areas. But you can't read a tract and get a whole bunch of high-powered sociologists and pay them huge amounts of money and hire 12 computers and defeat a revolution. But that's what they were into. And of course, you can't say that they didn't win. Because you see, by the time you come to the end of the 60s, if Vietnam is a lost cause, then the electronic battlefield and the rapid reply and the sociological think tanks and the mercenary armies and all of those are still there. And consequently, for all that you get out of Vietnam, you still have all of that terrific experience. The plain fact of the matter is that the Vietnamese, whose history we've traversed for quite a long while, had roots very deep, and you couldn't rip them up. And American policymakers never understood that. And it's a good lesson for all of us. That you see, without history, we're walking around with no eyes, walking around blind. And consequently, they lost in that specificity, but not in the design, and not in the whole strategic apparatus. And that, it seems to me, is critically important to remember. You get to the middle of the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson decides that it's all got to be escalated like hell, and the United States is riding high. It has reconstructed Western Europe. It has inserted it into its world scheme. It has repressed most of the colonial liberation movement. It has contained what it hoped to contain. And so don't underestimate that success. It's there. And if we talk at length about the Vietnamese, it's to say, well, God, it's good that they were there.